My name's Kyle. I am a lecturer at the University of Nevada in Reno. I've only been there a year. I'm Canadian, and I did my PhD at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. The other Kingston, as we say. And basically I look at issues of LGBTQ politics in transnational perspective. So I changed my paper up a little bit compared to the title. So the working title now is Queer as Jamaica, Queering Jamaica and Queering Religion in Jamaica. In this paper, basically, what I seek to do are two things. I seek to talk about the spiritual foundations of and resistance to heterosexism in Jamaica, but also, in order to talk about this, I first break down the construct of Jamaica as a homophobic other. And I think that's important, that we can talk about heterosexism in Jamaica without othering Jamaica as a homophobic other. And that's what a lot of my research looks at. It's important to do both, as talking about heterosexism in Jamaica without breaking down the function of these discourses in the context of Northern country neo-imperialism will not contribute to reducing heterosexism in the Jamaican context. Sexual othering of the Jamaican context without attending to structurally unequal economies, or without mentioning the British imperial origins of the buggery and gross indecency laws and of Christianity in Jamaica itself, as Maurice points out, will only result in hardening heterosexism among segments of the population rightly concerned about global northern influence after a history of such influence in the context of slavery, in the context of colonialism, and arguably, according to M. Jackie Alexander, who writes on Caribbean issues from a transnational feminist perspective, in the context of contemporary capitalist recolonization. And so we have to question how the construct of homophobic Jamaica functions in a neo-imperial context. And we have to disaggregate that from realities of heterosexism in Jamaica. We have to be able to do both. We have to be able to talk about the realities, but also question the construct and question how the construct itself could be linked to global racism, as well as global neo-imperialism and unequal economies between the North and South. Certainly Jamaica has an international reputation for heterosexism, the oppression of those who are not heterosexual. In my doctoral dissertation, which I just finished at the beginning of last year, happy to say, and in subsequent publications, I've explored how the material realities of heterosexism in Jamaica are often ideologically represented by the global North in problematic ways that reinforce racist and neo-imperialist constructions of Jamaica and Jamaicans. I've shown how these representations in their popular global Northern articulation and reception, though certainly often well-meaning, really have more to do in terms of vested interests with the necessity of constructing homophobic others in the context of Northern country homo-nationalism. That is to say, at this novel conjuncture of nationalism in the 21st century, in which some nation states like Canada suddenly understand themselves as inclusive of a gay and lesbian citizenry, it is necessary to contrast that national identity with nations and peoples within the nation, in fact, who are constructed as homophobic others. That rather than the homosexual being an other, which has been the case in the long history of modern nation states, suddenly there's a flip to the construction of homophobic others. And this can be problematic insofar as it's tied to neo-imperialism. And insofar as these discourses, as I've explored in the Canadian context about homophobic Jamaica, particularly emanating from Toronto, they often miss the history, complexity, and nuance of heterosexism in the Jamaican context. They're also not self-reflexive about continuing heterosexism in the Canadian context, and as I already mentioned, about relationality, unequal relationships between the Canadian context and the Jamaican context. Unless we, deconstruct these things, the promotion of LGBTIQ plus rights in the Jamaican context is likely to often result in a stiffening of heterosexist resolve and potential backlash, rather than more and more people joining into this struggle. That is to say, unless LGBTIQ plus, sorry, I'm trying to get it right in terms of how Queering Paradigms uses it. I usually just say LGBTQ. But unless we promote those rights in an intersectional fashion, Unless we promote those rights in a way that also talks about racism, that also talks about neo-imperialism, it's unlikely in the foreseeable future that a broad enough swath of the Jamaican population will come on board to being supportive of these rights protections. And even then, it will still be a tall order, but that type of approach based in solidarity rather than saving, right? Solidarity with queers in Jamaica rather than saving queers in Jamaica from the privileged positionality of, the benevolent imperial power in the global north is likely to meet with a much better reception. So I don't think that these constructions are benign in the sense that, this construction of homophobic other, sexually exceptional self, or homonational self, produces an air of moral superiority for northern nations that contributes to legitimizing their continually structurally dominant positions, along with allied global capitalist interests, politically, economically, militarily, and culturally, vis-a-vis nation states in the global south, particularly small post-colonial global southern nation states like Jamaica. Okay. So, one issue is that these continuing unequal economic relationships actually contribute to a lack of economic development, which it is broadly agreed upon is necessary in order to advance and enforce a robust human rights regime. So it's directly working at odds, the homophobic Jamaica construct, insofar as it keeps Jamaica in that economic position, which would make it harder to develop a robust, and it's largely developed, not completely, but it needs to be enforced, human rights regime. And then there's also the issue of reactionary heterosexist politics or backlash against the local LGBTIQ rights struggle as queer people and rights come to be viewed as foreign and, worse than foreign, come to be associated with global northern sexual morality, being imposed on Jamaica in a neo-imperial fashion in a supposedly post-colonial age. So my only argument here is that we have to be attentive to these considerations, that we have to break apart the difference between heterosexism in Jamaica and the construct of homophobic Jamaica. As I say in my paper, and I won't go over all of it now, at the same time, we need to recognize that activists face difficult strategic decisions. I've interviewed many Jamaicans and Jamaican Canadians, including activists, who talk about how the situation is so dire for many LGBTIQ plus Jamaicans that it's important just to shed light on the issue. And even if that means reinforcing the homophobic other construction, that it's a worthwhile trade-off strategically, right? We know that strategically sometimes different decisions have to be made on a case-by-case basis. And so I acknowledge that in my paper. Sorry, bear with me for just 1 second here. And it's also not to deny that the construct has a correspondence to material reality, as I've already pointed out. Ideologies don't just spring up out of thin air. They have a correspondence to material reality. Even if they simplify material reality, distort it, and so on and so forth, they have a correspondence. And likewise, homonationalism has a correspondence to material reality. So what I contend is that we can talk about heterosexism in Jamaica as a material structure in terms of legal structures and as a societal ideology, right? And let's look at ideology from that point of view rather than the outside othering ideology of homophobic Jamaica. Okay, so now that this important proviso is out of the way, and I really had to mention it because it forms the context of a lot of my thinking about these issues, I want to talk about a formally heterosexist nation state in Jamaica, a nation state structure in Jamaica, and specifically I want to briefly examine its religious ideological foundations and whether these foundations are perhaps being queerly eroded through counter-hegemonic religious argumentation and symbolism. I talk about in the paper how I use a Gramscian frame. I'm indebted to Antonio Gramsci. I won't go into more detail, but I'm also indebted to neo-Gramscian, arguably neo-Gramscian Stuart Hall, the late great Stuart Hall of the Jamaican context. Okay, so as part of my research for my doctoral dissertation. I conducted interviews, as I said, with a number of LGBTIQ plus Jamaicans in the diaspora and living in Jamaica. And I would like to go through some of their responses and listen to local people on the ground, on heterosexism in Jamaica and the religious influence on heterosexism in Jamaica. I have some other scholars in here cited, and I also have Maurice cited, who's written on the influence of fundamentalism. But let's look to just everyday people on what they think about how religion provides a legitimating ideological influence for heterosexism in Jamaica. So in response to a question asking about the main source of negative attitudes towards homosexuality in Jamaica, specifically whether such attitudes stem from the laws, the church, or dancehall music, and it should be noted all of the names have been changed to protect anonymity of the interviewees, in spite of the fact that many of the interviewees are out to family and friends, not always publicly. But basically, I asked whether these attitudes stem from the laws, the church, or dancehall music. Mr. Markson weighed in as follows, quote, "I would say basically from the church, because they go into the Bible and they quote that two persons of the same sex should not be involved in relationships. So I guess that's where it all comes from." When I asked Mr. Goodman whether the laws or culture have a larger role to play in popular attitudes concerning homosexuality, he emphasized religion, but also the necessity of legislative change. He said, "I think it's based in religion in that a lot of people use religion for their objections to homosexuality, if you go down to the root of it. However, I think in terms of a solution, there needs to be some form of legislative change. Yes, people might hold these beliefs, but if they are not sanctioned by the legislation, then we will have a chance to change certain views, and then we will not have a chance to change certain views, and so forth. But at the end of the day, if the government is sanctioning this kind of homophobia, then I find that there is very little that one can do." I've heard the religious arguments, because of course when you use religious arguments, it's easy to poke holes in them. And then once you start poking holes in them, they counter with, "So-and-so is illegal. You shouldn't be breaking the law," or "you should be arrested," or some crap like that. Mr. Goodman implicitly asserts here that religion, specifically a cultural form of Christianity, provides much of the ideological justification for currents of heterosexism in existence among segments of the population in civil society. Backed up by the coercive relations of political society, a popular cultural Christianity operates to gain consent to the heterosexist status quo. How am I doing for time? 5 minutes? Okay. So I could go into more, but I guess you'll have to wait for my paper. But what I will talk about now are the counter-hegemonic arguments. So in terms of counter-hegemonic arguments, so we know about the hegemonic arguments. We don't know enough about the counter-hegemonic arguments. So what I contend in this paper is, just as Jamaica is not a homophobic other, neither is the face of religion in Jamaica, of cultural Christianity, monolithic. Right now in Jamaica, in spite of very alarming statistics when it comes to whether people want to repeal the buggery law, 33% of Jamaicans believe that the government is not doing enough to support LGBT people. That's a significant minority. It's not 50%, but it's still a significant minority. And Jamaica is a very Christian nation. There are other religions as well, but often interviewees will describe Jamaican national identity as a Christian nation. And what this indicates, in a country that has the rumored most number of churches per square mile in the world, what this indicates is that some people are already reworking their Christianity in queer, inclusive ways. If 33% of the population feel this, that means that people are reworking their Christianity and thinking about it and articulating a counter-hegemonic response, not just to heterosexism, but to the dominant frame of fundamentalist Christianity. In other words, if that's a major source of heterosexism, then strategically, one of the ways to tackle that heterosexism is to use religious argumentation, is to use something that makes sense to the local population, to draw upon the lexicon that makes sense to the local population. In my paper, I draw on Abby Backen's work, and she shows how there's a long history of this, of using Christian language in the freedom struggles of Jamaica, beginning with slavery, and she calls this the religious idiom. And I explore in my paper how we can observe the religious idiom. There's still a long way to go in terms of development, but in terms of everyday Jamaicans, we can observe them using aspects of the religious idiom and using Christian teachings about love, about tolerance, about respect for diversity, about judge not lest you be judged, about the Good Samaritan, and so on and so forth. And what I wanted to see, I'll just close with this, what I wanted to see without prompting anyone. I didn't want to go into the interviews, prompting people and therefore finding religious counter-hegemony where there was no religious counter-hegemony. I believe that there was, but I wanted to take a more objective approach. What I did was I watched all 52 We Are Jamaicans videos. We Are Jamaicans is a campaign by JFLAG, as well as the Caribbean Vulnerable Communities Coalition, I believe. And basically it was a YouTube campaign with a number of videos with everyday Jamaicans, as well as with everyday Jamaicans who are queer and allies. And basically they talked about LGBT rights from the perspective of Jamaican nationalism, and the fact that rather than being constructed as outside of the nation, as not Jamaican, sometimes having to leave Jamaica, in fact, as we've seen. They tried to redefine that oppositional relationship between LGBT and Jamaican nationalism and show that LGBT people are of the Jamaican nation, as the Jamaican motto says, out of many, one people, and they adapt that to LGBT issues. And what I did was I watched all 52 just to see if I could see if there were religious arguments consistent with the religious idiom, whether there were spiritual arguments being made. And indeed, there are some videos that zero in on a Holy Bible, and in which an individual talks about how discrimination is not part of her journey with Christ. There's also a video of an Anglican priest and rector, and he talks about the parable of the Good Samaritan, and he talks about making the distinction between sexual orientation and sexual acts, right? And that could be a promising way forward in the Jamaican context to persuade people that you might disagree with these sexual acts, that is to say sodomy, but you have to distinguish between that and sexual orientation. And you have to provide human rights based on sexual orientation, because human rights are part of the Christian message. Just as religious liberty, a human right, is part of the Christian message. So that's basically what I do, is I just go through all of the different videos that basically have themes of religious argumentation, of invoking Christianity, or of invoking African spiritual traditions to argue for LGBT liberation. And I think it's interesting that if you take this We Are Jamaicans campaign as a representative sample of where the counter-hegemonic struggle is right now in Jamaica on queer rights, it's interesting that you can take that and take a look at it and see that indeed there is religious argument, counter-argument going on. I make the point in the paper that it's outweighed by liberal human rights arguments that are exclusively secular and that don't mention religion. It's also outweighed by nationalist arguments, so appeal to the Jamaican motto, for example. But the fact that it's there explicitly at all, I think, shows that it can't be ignored. In a country where the hegemonic fabric of heterosexism is so informed by religion, when you advance counter-hegemony in that context, you can't ignore the religious arguments. So it'll be an interesting coalition and kind of a grafting on of liberal rights arguments, religious arguments, and nationalist arguments. And of course, they're not mutually exclusive, right? Someone could hear a liberal human rights argument and hear it in a secular way, and someone else could hear it in a religious way. But I think the fact that we see it so explicitly here shows that maybe this would be a useful strategy moving forward to actually, invoke these arguments more and more as a way of moving from that 33% to 50%. And I'll leave it at that, but thank you for your time.